Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This week's episode is with Dr. Jaclene Begley, and we're talking about how unexpected changes in housing wealth affect people's decisions about when to retire or even to reverse retirement and return to the labor market. As our listeners are well aware, housing wealth has a massive impact on society, and for most households, it is the largest source of wealth that they have. On top of all that, or maybe because of that, the presence or absence of significant housing wealth is a very strong predictor of other important life outcomes. Retirement decisions are really just one area that housing wealth impacts our lives, and we could just as easily talk about its role in driving the racial wealth gap, facilitating higher education and entrepreneurial opportunities, or influencing voting and other forms of civic engagement, and hopefully we will talk about those things in later episodes. But this conversation is an important one because there aren't really many bigger decisions in one's life than when to retire. Jackie and her colleague find that when people experience negative, unexpected shocks to their home value, they're less likely to retire or collect Social Security and more likely to come out of retirement compared to households who don't experience those negative shocks. We talk about the nuances of those findings and what they might tell us about future housing policy reforms. And since this is one of our first episodes talking about housing wealth in detail, we also discuss the consequences of relying on mass homeownership as a substitute for a strong social safety net. Spoiler, it is not great. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, with production support from Claudia Bustamante and Jason Suteja, and Divine Mutoni on transcripts. You can reach me at shanephillips@ucla.edu, and you can give the show a 5-star rating at Apple or Spotify. For the planners out there, you can also get AICP credit just for listening to the show. With that, let's get to our conversation with Dr. Jaclene Begley. Jaclene Begley received her doctoral degree from NYU and is now a senior economist and research director at Fannie Mae. And she's here to discuss her research on how housing wealth affects people's work and retirement decisions. Housing wealth is really at the center of so many housing policy decisions and a lot of the politics around housing. So we're definitely going to talk about the role this wealth plays in society more generally as well. Jackie, thanks for joining us and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And Pavo is my co-host today. Hey, Pavo.
Hey, Shane. Jackie, thanks so much for doing this. I'm excited to talk about your paper.
Thanks, me too.
We always start off with our guests giving us a quick tour of a city or a town that they know well. And since Jackie is based in DC, she's going to be touring us around there. DC is not new to a lot of urban planning nerds like us, but are there any favorite places you like to take visitors or tell them to check out?
Right. So I think DC has a lot to offer urban planners. What I think is most interesting about DC is the fact that it's a city and then also has sort of like a state government component to it. But my favorite things to do in DC are just walking around different neighborhoods and exploring the architecture. I recently discovered the Main Avenue Fish Market, which I read some trivia is the oldest fish market in the U.S. And that's definitely interesting to check out. And also the obvious answer is all the Smithsonian's are free. And before I lived here, I'd never been to the National Archives or the Library of Congress. And I think they're both underappreciated.
Can I ask you how Fannie's offices compare to HUD? HUD has famously unpleasant offices. How are Fannie Mae's?
The exact opposite. Fannie Mae is in a brand new office at the former Washington Post headquarters site. It's a brand new building, thoroughly modern, high tech. So
as befits its role in the nation's economy. Before we get into the paper, I wanted to ask you about the research team at Fannie Mae. So I understand this is a growing effort on the part of one of the GSEs.
Yeah, so the team that I'm part of is fairly new in the last 7 years or so. And we are part of an emphasis to grow our thought leadership capacity. And so my team specifically focuses on housing affordability research for external consumption, academic quality, long-term papers focusing on lots of different topics. Right now, an emphasis on racial equity. And then we also help internally with questions the business has where they need an understanding of the research.
Cool. Sounds interesting.
And can you actually give us a quick, elevator pitch on what Fannie Mae does? Pavo used the acronym GSE, which is a government-sponsored enterprise, of which there are several just in the housing finance space. So what is Fannie Mae's role in all of that?
So I'm here today representing my own views and not those of Fannie Mae nor the Federal Housing Finance Agency. But in general, Fannie Mae's role is to buy mortgages from banks. We help support the secondary mortgage market. So we buy mortgages from banks and then package them into securities and then sell them on the secondary mortgage market. We also, though, have some emphasis on things like helping moderate middle income households. So like we have an emphasis on supporting the mortgage market in the middle income space. And then we also helped with underserved markets. So we have this focus on duty to serve markets, which are things like rural markets where typically there's less lending there. So we also have some focus to help these areas.
Got it. So today's article is titled The Effect of Housing Wealth Shocks on Work and Retirement Decisions. It was co-authored with Sue and Chan, and it was published in 2018 in the Journal of Regional Science and Urban Economics. You've studied how people's retirement decisions are affected by changes in the value of their homes. And there's a lot of great stuff in this article, including what I found to be very large impacts on decision-making and surprising differences between people affected by moderate price shocks versus larger price shocks. Before we even talk about housing wealth, though, there's a broader and older academic literature that looks at how wealth more generally influences household decisions, not just housing wealth. And I think that's a good place to start. Can you tell us what the literature says about how asset value or wealth fluctuations, again, especially for non-housing assets like stocks, affects people's behavior? What are the impacts on decisions around work and retirement specifically? And what other important ways can positive or negative shocks to wealth affect household behavior?
Great, thanks. That's a really important question. This is important background context for the paper. So most generally, if we assume that people are making trade-offs between working and other fun activities that economists would call leisure time, we would basically assume that any sort of increase in wealth would decrease your incentive to work and increase your leisure time. So the literature on non-housing assets generally finds that declines in asset values through stocks really only have a weak effect on individual labor force participation, which is surprising because like I said, you would assume that if you have an increase in wealth, you would decrease your labor market participation. But the difficulty in the literature is that when stock markets increase or decrease, it's usually correlated with the broader economy. So labor markets are also experiencing these positive or negative fluctuations at that time. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to untangle these two effects. So we don't know if decisions around retirement are due to the labor market rather than the stock market. On the other hand, there are studies that look at unexpected effects of things like inheritance or winning the lottery.
Right.
And in those cases, we actually see some really clear influences on people's behavior. So people are more likely to retire early if they win the lottery. This suggests that unexpected shocks to household wealth really will affect retirement and labor market participation in general. But it's hard with a lot of with things like stocks to untangle these effects.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, and you might not know the answer to this question, but I wonder whether the correlation between people's earnings and their prevalence of owning stocks is figured into this literature at all, just because you'd imagine the people that have wealth make more money. And so when the labor market's doing well, they have the opportunity to make even more money. And so they opt not to take the leisure and work more.
That could be. I don't know the literature as well. It makes sense, though. Like the stock market, people who own stocks are definitely different than the broader home ownership population in the U.S. Yeah. And then the other thing that the literature finds is really there's a lot of status quo bias. So if you're working and you're planning on retiring maybe at 65 or 67, a stock market increase may not change your decision. Right. It's hard to unpack that. Like you might just continue to work. Mm-hmm. Whereas a decrease in your savings might incentivize you to work longer because now you're like, I won't have as much wealth. But for a lot of people, maybe having just some more wealth is just an added bonus, but not enough to make you retire.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm.
And you lay out several reasons that the standard economic theory about how wealth shocks affect decision-making might not apply to housing wealth. And in some cases, changes to housing wealth might actually have the opposite effect of shocks on other kinds of wealth. What are some of those reasons and what makes housing different?
Right. So this is really important. So the majority of Americans are homeowners, and in particular, the majority of older adults are homeowners. The homeownership rate is really high among seniors. Housing wealth is also the largest form of wealth holdings for most Americans. So as I was saying, many more Americans own homes than own stocks. But housing is also unique because there's this consumption value to it, meaning that you live in your home, it provides shelter, you have emotional attachment to your home and to the specific location where you live. So this may make homeowners more detached from the pure asset value of their home. It's also a less liquid asset, so it takes longer to sell a home. There's high transaction costs to selling, and it's also harder to know the true market value of your home. So with stock markets, we have a really clear understanding of the value. Your house, it's more fuzzy. We have some indicators from AVMs, but you actually don't know what the transaction price will be ahead of time.
Right. You can only find out after selling.
Right. The true market value is what it transacts at on the market, and it's a lot harder to see that.
Although that has changed a lot. I feel like people are much more aware of their home value these days than they were 15, 20 years ago.
If you assume that AVMs are accurate.
If you believe Redfin.
AVMs are what?
It's an automated valuation model.
Okay.
So I know from looking at my own value of my own house that Redfin versus Zillow gives me wildly different estimates.
Right.
And it changes a lot, like month to month, in a way that the actual price probably is not.
Right. They're noisy, but that is a fair point, right? Now people may be more aware that they can gauge at least sort of the market value of their home. But then, then the last thing I was going to say is that there's also, we know, like strong bequest motives in the housing. So people tend to want to save their housing to give it to their children. Some of my dissertation work shows this. So all of this means that people may be less likely to react to changes in housing wealth compared to other forms of wealth.
And this correlation that you brought up between labor markets and housing wealth seems especially important. Most of the previous research on housing wealth shocks and retirement decisions didn't find much impact, if any. And the labor market, housing market relationship seems like it might go a long way toward explaining why. Could you dig into that relationship a bit further and why it's important?
Yeah, so it is really important. And I think this is a real challenge in the empirical literature because of the fact that housing and labor markets are so highly correlated. And so when there's a national recession or a local economic downturn, the housing market is also going to decline. And when the labor market is doing really well, or for example, Amazon is coming to DC, the housing market's also going to respond and become more expensive. So in the case of retirement, people may be forced to retire earlier than expected if the labor market is declining, which is not actually a reaction to housing wealth declines, but a reaction to the fact that they're, getting left out of a weak labor market. And so a challenge for us in our identification strategy in this paper is to find a convincing way to separate out labor market effects from housing market effects to really understand the true effect of, housing value declines on people's labor market decisions.
Yeah. And it seems like this might actually be more of a problem for people at or near retirement age, because you hear about, when someone's industry is shrinking or going away, during the Great Recession, for example, how older people who had, maybe done a different kind of job for the past 30 years were in some cases struggling more than others to find new employment, maybe in an entirely different industry. And so I don't know how this might affect the results, but it does seem important, at that household level.
Yes, that's really fair, right? So it's harder for older adults potentially to find another job or switch industries. And there is evidence of this in the literature that makes it even more challenging for people to recover from something like the Great Recession.
So we're talking about price shocks, basically unexpected increases or decreases in the value of people's homes. But in the context of this article, how big are the price shocks that we're talking about? How big or small does a household's housing wealth need to depart from their expectations or from just its starting point in order to be categorized as either a positive or a negative shock, and maybe even a moderate sized shock versus a large shock?
In our paper, we're looking at any deviation from zero. So we're talking about positive shocks or negative shocks, and we put them into buckets. So we do, for positive shocks, 0 to 5%, then 5 to 10%, and then over 10%, which we consider a large shock to housing values. And then the same for negative. We look at 0 to 5, negative shock, and then 5 to 10, and then greater than 10. And we did experiment with different ways of modeling the shocks and the different sizes of shocks. But these buckets were the ones that made the most sense at the end of the day with the data.
Okay, great. Kind of stepping outside of the article itself a bit, I think it's helpful to start kind of early here with a little bit of a conversation about just housing wealth generally and home ownership in the United States and how it factors into retirement decisions in particular. What I wanted to ask you to do actually, though, was kind of make a case for and a case against our reliance on homeownership as a tool of savings, as a means of saving for retirement, having something to pass on to your children, all these things that people want out of housing. I think these things have come up in previous episodes, but we've never really talked about the wealth side from a research perspective. So I know there are positive and negative arguments. So how do you think about those things?
Right. So there's lots of benefits to home ownership. It sounds like you've talked about these in prior episodes. From a wealth building perspective, for one thing, housing is an accessible form of wealth. So this means that people buy a home, they can live in a home. A lot of people want to own a home, right? The government incentivizes us to own homes. So housing seems to be a simpler way of owning than owning a stock, for example, which is more complicated. And housing has a forced savings mechanism. So the whole mortgage market system is set up so that you put a little bit of your equity away with each mortgage payment. You're building up the equity in your home. And so over time, it's this natural forced savings. We also have lots of tax benefits to owning a home that make it, tax advantageous to own a home. And then the fact that there's also this consumption value is nice because you get to live in your home and then you also derive wealth from it. So it's this really unique asset in that sense. On the downside, as we see in the paper, well, first of all, there's a few things. In the paper, we see, the timing of when you buy or sell your home can affect how much wealth you have in your home at the end of the day. And so it's not that everyone's going to, retire when their housing wealth is up. Some people are potentially want to retire and their housing wealth has dropped. And so there's forced savings, but it's not as predictable as you would hope for something about, this is going to be my retirement wealth. And I'm going to use this in my old age. And then there's also this other aspect of it in the literature that we don't really talk about in the paper, but that we really don't see that people downsize or move as they age. So people really aren't tapping into their housing wealth the way you would expect for the amount of time that we push housing wealth is the best thing you should be doing. This is the predominant form of savings for most Americans. We just don't see people using their wealth.
I don't want to digress too much on the topic of housing wealth, but I do think a lot of those points are important to have in mind. And, I think it is better to have a system where housing wealth isn't people's main form of savings or patrimony, but those systems are hard to develop if you look around the world, right? A few countries have developed a robust non-housing wealth method of having retirement savings accounts, but most countries are still using real estate as a way, kind of one of the main ways people build wealth.
Right.
But so speaking of the transition to retirement, I think this is a super important question. And I wanted you to kind of give us a better understanding of what we know about how people make this decision to retire.
So this is really important and something that I was surprised about when I started working on this paper. I think that I expected retirement to be a clearly defined decision for most people, but you actually don't see that. So in the data, you see that people will say, oh, I'm retired, but then I should back up and say, we're using the health and retirement study in this paper. And so part of a big focus of that data set, it's a biennial panel where they interview people over time. A big focus of that is obviously retirement and working decisions. So there are a number of questions in the panel about, are you retired? How much are you working? How many hours a week do you work? And one thing that was surprising to me was that people will say, oh, I'm retired, but then they'll also say, oh, but I'm working, or I'm retired, but I work 10 hours a week, right? So I think people self-identify as retired, but they're also still working. And some of this might have to do with being not in their original career level job, working in maybe a bridge job, or, retiring officially, but then still doing some consulting or working part-time, or maybe working in a different field now. So this for us was a challenge, trying to figure out how do we define retirement.
I think there's also, something I've heard about is how people, at least this is more true of unemployed people, but someone who is, say, 64, 63, whatever, who is unemployed, but then transitions to retirement, just that title change, like functionally, there's no real difference. They were unemployed before, they're unemployed after. And yet calling themselves retired changes their own self-conception. They actually become happier people because of this. So I think just like there might be an aversion to describing yourself in certain ways. You know, you'd rather call yourself retired even if you're still working rather than call yourself like a part-time employee at the, you know, local grocery store or something like that.
Right. I think that's fair. And then you see that on the flip side, right? You don't want people who say they're retired might not want to admit that now they're working again. And that was one of the concerns we had too with modeling retirement reversals, was that maybe people are working, but they don't want to say that they're not retired because, you know, it's just, there may be some stigma associated with that.
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. I wonder whether you worried about cohort effects also, just because I think that a lot of this kind of cultural associations with how long someone should work, you know, when you should be retired or when you should not be retired, I think changes a lot over time.
Yep, I think that's really fair. And I don't think we really have any baby boomers in our sample, or we get just a small amount of baby boomers in our sample, but you could imagine that might change. And so there definitely is probably a cohort effect going on.
So when you're measuring these positive or negative shocks to housing values, I think it's important to note that you're not just looking at absolute changes in value. You're also trying to take into account the expectations people have about the future, which I imagine in most cases are expectations of growth. So for example, if a house fell in value from $400,000 to $350,000 over a 2-year period, you know, say during the Great Recession or right after, the actual price shock relative to expectations is probably larger than $50,000 because the owner may have expected the value to rise to, say, $425,000 instead of fall to $350,000. Without getting too deep into the methodology here, could you explain why you took that approach to measuring price shocks and why that was important to the methodology of this study?
Sure. So there are a few reasons. One I think I didn't mention earlier was that we really wanted to capture the unanticipated component of housing value changes. And the reason for that is that economic theory states that people should respond to unanticipated expectations, whereas anticipated expectations, they would have already incorporated into their behavior. So for example, if I expect I'm going to get a bonus this year, and I have a good sense of how much it would be, then I'm probably already changing my spending or planning savings around that. But then if I get a surprise bonus or I don't get a bonus, even though I was expecting to get this amount, I would be more likely to react to that. And we should see a reaction there. So we were looking for the unanticipated change in housing values because we think that's what really would influence behavior. And we're also trying to follow some of the literature on this. So there's other studies that show that these expectations are maybe what matter for measuring shocks. But we also build on these prior studies because we are looking at sort of like metropolitan area growth trends and applying them to local zip codes. And one of the reasons we're doing that is we're trying to separate out these broader labor market issues, or labor market changes from local housing market changes. So as I said before, the conundrum we have is how do we get the labor market fluctuations and take them away from housing price fluctuations? So we were using this expectations model and this metropolitan combined with zip code level trends to look at, to sort of separate that out, to get another way to help us figure out how do we know the true effect of housing price shocks on people's behavior.
Yeah, I think it's a really clever way to get at that issue, because if you think about like a metropolitan labor market doesn't fluctuate at a neighborhood level as much as the housing market fluctuates at the neighborhood level within a metropolitan area. So very, very clever way to do it.
Thank you. So that's exactly what we were thinking. We were thinking, the metropolitan market's probably really correlated, but if we could get at this zip code level effect, then we'll start to untangle that.
The expectation stuff is really interesting to me, and I'm wondering, maybe there's just more literature on this, but do we have any sense for how much expectations really matter? I mean, clearly you just said in some ways it's what is determining decision-making changes, but I guess I'm wondering about scale here, the comparison of the absolute change versus the expectations, and whether people maybe feel the gap between expectations and reality more or less strongly than just the absolute change in their housing value. I don't really ask this as a question relating to the study here, but it does interest me because I think it may have some bearing on the politics of housing affordability. like if we want to improve affordability, which is many of our goals here, one way we could do that is by causing prices to fall over time, one way or another. And you can easily imagine a big backlash to that from homeowners who would, in some real sense, be losing money. Alternatively, we could improve housing affordability over time by slowing or stopping the rise in prices, but not necessarily turning the price direction to a negative. So long as incomes were rising at a faster pace than housing, it would be getting more affordable in real terms. But the more that expectations matter, the more it seems that even that latter scenario could face serious opposition and backlash, again, even if people's home values were still going up and not losing any value.
Right. So I've been thinking a lot about this too lately, particularly with another project I've been working on where we're looking at itemizing the full costs of ownership over the life cycle, including things like transaction costs, which I think people don't think about. So I think there's a lot of unexpected and unexpected variation in owning. But then I think your main point is really about the unique challenges of housing and how we understand housing affordability. Housing being an asset, but also a consumption good. So there's a lot of literature that does a great job. I'm thinking particularly of this John Quigley and Stephen Raphael paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives that talks about housing affordability. They do a really nice job of laying out the competing forces at play here. But I think the most important part from that paper is they state maybe the obvious that rising housing prices are great for current homeowners, not good for people who want to be first-time home buyers. And at the end of the day, I think affordability for homeowners over the last 10 years or so hasn't been a challenge. Like housing is actually, because interest rates have been so low, housing has been more affordable. Homeownership, not housing, homeownership has been more affordable. What's been a challenge is really for getting first-time home buyers into homeownership. And then to back up to this question of expectations, I think this is an empirical question that we don't have a good answer for, whether or not it's your expected gain in wealth versus your actual gain in wealth. That's really going to make someone more of a NIMBY or less of a NIMBY with caring about how to affect housing affordability broadly. But I do think homeowners at the end of the day vote to protect their asset values. And I'm not sure whether people would differentiate between a decrease in value versus a decrease in the expected increase in value. At the end of the day, both of those might just be bad news for a homeowner. So if I lose the $50,000 versus I just didn't gain the $10,000 I was expecting to gain, I think homeowners will think about both of those as a problem for someone who's thinking about their home as an investment. But I also think that tying it all back together to like the cost of home ownership, if you try to stop the rise in prices, it may be hard for people to actually break even on their homes when you factor in the transaction costs on their investments and other costs related to being a homeowner.
So the three outcomes you're really measuring here are decisions to retire, decisions to reverse retirement, to come out of retirement, and then the timing of claiming Social Security benefits. I think those first two are pretty straightforward in what we're talking about, but can you talk about the significance of claiming Social Security benefits or the timing of it? I think some people may not even be aware, especially maybe our younger listeners, that the amount you can claim depends on when you actually claim it.
Right. So that was, again, we looked at people transitioning towards retirement, people transitioning away from retirement, and then people transitioning to claim Social Security. And Social Security is a unique question because, like you said, you can claim Social Security early. And if you do, you get less of a benefit, but you get benefit over a longer period of time. Or you can claim Social Security at the age that's appropriate based on your birth year. It's age 65 to 67, I think, right now. Or you can claim it later. And if you claim it later than that, you get more of a benefit per month, but you have less years to collect it over time. And so these benefits should all be actuarially fair. And there's a long literature like trying to game out when people claim Social Security and why. And for us, this was more of an empirical question. Like there's a lot of literature that shows that Social Security claims happen when you retire, but not necessarily. And so we were wondering if people might start claiming Social Security as a way to improve liquidity, even if they weren't actually retiring. We didn't see a lot of that. Ultimately, empirically in the data, we saw that Social Security outcomes were really similar to the retirement outcomes, and because they are correlated. But we were curious about whether if your housing values are going down, maybe you are going to claim Social Security, but not retire, just to get the additional payments.
Got it. So now getting into the results, again, you and Dr. Chan looked at the impact of housing wealth shocks on people's decisions to retire or reverse their retirements by returning to the workforce and also claim Social Security benefits. Tell us what you found comparing people with positive and negative housing wealth shocks and wealth shocks that were either moderate or large in either of those directions. There's a lot of surprising stuff in here about how big the effects were, how they differed by gender and other characteristics, and how they varied over time, especially pre and post Great Recession.
Right. So for men, we find that relative to our reference group in the data, basically, negative shocks of a moderate level are associated with reductions in the probability of transitioning to retirement, meaning people are working longer. Mm-hmm. And then when we look at larger negative shocks, we expected them to have a bigger effect on retirement delays, but we actually don't find that in the data. And we think this is because of this challenge of controlling for labor market effects, which we throw a lot of things in the model. We try a lot of robustness checks, controlling for things like local unemployment, employment wage growth, looking at specific industries of employment in MSA, but we still just don't see anything there for large negative shocks. And we think we just can't fully control that in our models to find an effect there.
And I did want to just say that the sizes of the effects here, it was for negative shocks of 0 to negative 5%. We were talking about a 14% reduction in decisions to retire. And for negative 5 to negative 10% reductions or price shocks in the home values, it was a negative 18% or an 18% increase in decisions not to retire, I guess would be one way of putting that. But that's a really significant amount. I mean, almost 20% of people who might have retired during that period didn't, because of a, 5 to 10% decline in their expected home values.
That's not 100% the way to interpret it. It's an 18% decline in the probability of retiring, but it's a 3.7 percentage point reduction. Right. But yes, it's not a trivial number. And it does show that people are reacting to these negative shocks in housing values. On the flip side, though, we actually didn't see anything for positive shocks, which is, consistent with what literature has found and what I was saying before about status quo bias, where people may just not incorporate positive shocks into their behavior. But a negative shock we did find was associated with a retirement delay.
It does seem to point toward, coming back to that last question about expectations, it seems like if we can avoid people's home values experiencing negative shocks relative to expectations, that's good. That has negative impacts on people. It's something that people are going to feel and maybe have responses to in the way they vote and so forth. But there's almost like no obvious upside to positive shocks beyond their expectations. It's just they don't even notice them, or like their behavior doesn't change in response to them. So if we could at least limit that from happening, these positive shocks beyond expectations, that might be like a good starting point. And then we can worry about the negative stuff later.
I wonder, so Jackie, you had cited some other papers that didn't take this approach and they hadn't found any relationship between price fluctuations and people's retirement decisions. Could you just mention how these results differ from those?
There are some other papers that look at housing price changes and retirement decisions. A lot of them are using metropolitan level housing price data. And not all of them are trying to get at a shock to values. Some of them are just looking at the changes over time. And then some of the papers are also using a pre-Great Recession time period. We start working on this during the tail end of the Great Recession. So a lot of the prior literature was just using the boom. And I think it's important to note, I hadn't said this before, that prior to the housing price boom and the Great Recession of the aughts, we didn't see these crazy fluctuations in housing values. Like we hadn't, I think this was surprising to people. Now, maybe less so, that given that we've had this a decade ago financial crisis, but I think these fluctuations in housing values, the boom and bust, were a unique situation. And so now we've got a lot more information. We have Zillow, we have ABMs, we've had this experience with the Great Recession. Now things might be different, but at the time, I think that this was unique, right? This was a unique point in time to measure these shocks.
Yeah, although it is impressive how short people's time horizons can be. I think talking to people and looking at housing markets in the US right now, people already forgot about the Great Recession to some extent, right? But
Yeah.
I think
well, that's
also,
why I had to
I mean,
remind you, because one time I was presenting this and people were like, why were people shocked that their housing values
wait,
fell? And
housing values go down? No way.
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, wait, no.
Yeah, and I think, but, and thinking about where they went down and where they didn't in a metropolitan area, I don't know if you've thought about this at all, but, you can imagine it's the lower priced parts of the region that lost much more value than the higher priced parts of the region where people don't have to sell during the bust. Does that factor into this work at all?
Yeah, so we didn't unpack that in the paper as much, but that is part of our theory as to why, particularly with things like retirement reversals, we don't see as much movement. And I think it's what we think is it's because the areas that were hit the worst, that had the most negative shocks, likely are different and have, different labor market access than other parts of the metropolitan area. So even though we are trying to unpack the metropolitan area from the neighborhood, there's still going to be some local variation that we can't capture. Right. But like I said, our contribution really is getting at these more local effects. A lot of the other papers, even if they say local at the time we're using metropolitan data, the Zillow data was still fairly new at this time too, like the zip code level data that they have available.
Right. And we'll get into the further heterogeneous effects, but I wanted to just get your thoughts on this, the big picture takeaway that, when things are bad, you get a negative shock, you go back to work. When things are good, you get a positive shock, you just stay working. What does that say about humans? Like, where's this leisure time that people are supposed to be accessing with all that wealth?
Well, it may have to do with the fact that this is housing wealth, and like I said before, it's trickier to access it. It's lumpy, but it's still wealth. So I think maybe people are just more reactive to a loss in value, whereas the positive, it's not like a stock where you can cash out right away. Right. So, and I think also with retirement, people have, like I said before, the status quo bias. Like people have in their head, I'm going to retire at 67. Maybe you're not going to retire at 64 then, just because your housing wealth went up. Whereas on the flip side, if you were going to retire at 67 and your housing wealth is dropping, now you're like, oh, well, maybe I'll work another year.
That makes sense.
And maybe, you're not working less. I mean, maybe you are working less, but you're still employed. And so your status doesn't change. But also maybe you're working the same amount, but your consumption just gets a little fancier because you have more money, or you can pull from a home equity line of credit and so forth. So your vacations are a little nicer. You get a bigger boat or whatever, as one does.
We do look in the paper at like partial transitions to retirement, but we find the biggest effects for people who are like fully retired or not fully retired.
And then Paavo mentioned the other heterogeneous effects. So you talked about men. How about for women?
Right. So it was important that we separate the sample by men and women. A lot of the labor literature finds differential effects of men's reaction to economic downturns versus women's. And we don't really find an analogous effect for women. So we do see some effects for women when we look at those that have some subgroups, like those that have fully employed partners or spouses, but we don't in general see a strong response from women. It's really men. And then we also look at other things like retirement reversals in our sample. And we, for the most part, don't see a lot of movement on retirement reversals. But again, for some subgroups, we see that like men who are self-described as fully retired and those who have mortgages are more likely to reverse retirement. And this goes back to what I was saying before, that we think that there's something different about the labor markets, the hardest hit, potentially like these local markets. So we're just not able to capture some of what people who might want to go back to work, but can't find a job.
And so that is the retirement decisions, the decisions to transition into retirement. Pretty big effects there, especially for men, or really primarily or almost only for men. What about decisions to reverse retirement, to come out of retirement, and also to claim Social Security benefits during this time period?
Right. So for reversals, for people coming out of retirement, we really don't see a lot of movement in the data. We only find effects for a subsample of the population. So for men, those who are self-described as fully retired and those who have mortgages are more likely to come out of retirement as a result of a negative housing price shock. Part of it is when we looked at our sample of people who were already retired, those are the people who could come out of retirement. They just look different than the full sample. So there were people in worse health. They were older. lots of reasons that would make it more difficult to actually come out of retirement. So we only found effects on a small subsample. Our Social Security claims, which we weren't sure the direction of how that would go. We weren't sure if people would think about it as coincident with retirement or if people would claim Social Security early to get the liquidity benefit of having the income stream from Social Security. We actually found that the results were pretty similar to retirement decisions. So the negative shocks, people were more likely to claim Social Security when they experienced negative shock.
I think one other thing in the results that surprised me was that there were no differences, or you didn't find any differences by race or ethnicity. And I think even, thinking about what Pava was saying earlier about how you might expect more impacts on communities with lower home values, which would disproportionately be communities of color, you might imagine that there would be some disparate impact there. So how do you think about the fact that you didn't find any differences by race or ethnicity?
That's a good question. I don't have a great answer. I know we didn't find any differential effects when we looked at the sample across race or ethnicity. It could be the behavior across groups was similar, and we didn't have a large enough concentration of people in the zip codes that had really big negative shocks that we could tease out an effect. It may just be a sample size issue in the data, but we didn't wind up seeing it, and we note that in the paper, as you rightly point out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe given that you found that in places that had the largest negative shocks, the labor market outcomes, or at least this is one possible explanation for why you didn't see the same impact on retirement decisions, is maybe because the labor market changes outweighed that or offset the changes in decision making. Or so maybe that's something that was going on here too, is because there's probably those communities might have experienced much larger negative price shocks. And so they're all kind of more likely to fall into that category.
It could be that we just weren't able to get an effect on the coefficients. Yeah, it could be that. I think there's something there in that story.
So you mentioned sample size, and so you're using survey data. I wonder how reliable you think these survey data are, and whether you'd think you'd find maybe different results if you had a full data set of everybody's employment history.
I think the health and retirement study is a really robust data source that has a lot of questions on labor market participation and housing values and health. That being said, it's all self-reported, like you mentioned, and it's people have individual biases on their retirement status, what their housing is worth, their expectations, how they answer these questions. I mean, it's a panel data set, so it follows people over time, and they do answer questions differently from wave to wave, which is, interesting too. So it's a really robust data set to use, but to your point, right, it's administrative data and people may not know how much. I mean, there's evidence in the literature. People don't know how much their house is worth. People misreport their housing values, and seniors in particular, because they've lived in their homes for so long, just don't have a good sense of the market value of their home. So there's going to be biases in the data that we can't control for or tease out.
Yeah, I mean, presumably the claiming Social Security would be the least biased measure. So I think it's useful that you include that as well.
Right. Hopefully people are reporting that accurately.
Right. They might not think of themselves as retired yet, or think of themselves as retired even if they're working. But, they're claiming Social Security or not is probably pretty reliable.
Right. And since it's a panel, you can see, did they say they started reclaiming it at a reasonable age too, right?
Right.
Jackie, you touched on this a little bit, but as I was reading this, I kept coming back to how important timing and really luck is when it comes to the benefits of homeownership. And I feel like this study really highlights that in some ways. There's the luck of whether you happen to be in a place with a strong and a growing labor market, which is totally out of the hands of individual homeowners, and the timing of whether you bought in 2003 or 2007 or 2011, which just strikes me as something that regular people mostly can't and really shouldn't have to game out so carefully when it comes to choosing where they live, such a basic and important fundamental decision. Ideally, people could move when it makes sense for them, their jobs, their families, whatever. But when housing is used as a primary source of wealth, then it's inevitably going to be treated as an investment. And that's often in conflict with the consumption benefits of housing, because something that's a great investment will become more unattainable as its price goes up. I think that's almost definitional. I guess where I'm going with this is just to wonder how you felt about these results, less as a researcher maybe, and maybe more at a philosophical or an emotional level. I'll say for my part, they kind of bummed me out in that I feel like in a better world, the value of people's houses wouldn't play such a big role in these important decisions, like when to transition from one phase of your life to another.
Yes. I agree with you that it's a total bummer. And I feel like there are a lot of difficult questions around our societal emphasis on home ownership as a wealth building tool, but not a lot of policy solutions or no perfect menu of solutions for how to handle these real questions about how do we deal with wealth at the end of life? How do we deal with the fact that housing is a consumption vehicle, but also a wealth building vehicle? Pablo mentioned that we're not unique as a country for our reliance on home ownership. This is a common thing that many nations have. But I think to your point, there's still a lot to learn, and the timing and sustainability of home ownership and who really benefits from appreciation, particularly these questions about local nuances in markets and the timing and role of mortgages, racial disparities across groups. I think these are all really important questions that are gaining more traction recently, but overall are surprisingly understudied. There are a handful of papers from the Great Recession period that look at, is housing sustainable? Did people benefit, and who benefited from home ownership? But there's only a handful. And I really think there's a lot more we could do to better understand these questions. And then we could start to think at, prescriptive policy solutions that actually help, targeted policy to help, create solutions to these questions or these issues. And I do think our reliance on housing wealth is a problem, and we need more non-housing related policy tools.
Yeah, and more. I mean, I echo the call for more housing and demographics research. I think it's an understudied connection there. And we didn't talk about how housing wealth might affect younger households' decisions about, where to live and how to form families and all these things. But there's definitely a role of housing wealth in many other aspects of people's lives.
And the Lewis Center is always accepting gifts and grants to study exactly these things.
So turning back to more pragmatic concerns, I'm curious to know what you think could or should be done with these findings in terms of public policy. So I think we've talked about some of the negative implications of the research, but it certainly seems important that we know this relationship between housing wealth and retirement decision really exists, which is something that previous research didn't identify. So what, are there opportunities for reform that could come out of this work?
So my personal opinion is that we need a better social safety net. There's been a lot of reform since the Great Recession particularly in the mortgage market, but I think we need a better solution than housing as the main source of wealth for households. Or maybe if housing is the main source of wealth, we have some other more robust social security system that provides better income security for households over time. We need to do more to ensure that older households have access to adequate resources as they age, including, age-appropriate housing that can be modified to allow for people who want to age in place, or better options of housing for people who want to age in place. More housing supply would provide more diversity of housing units that would allow people to downsize and actually tap into their housing wealth.
So different kinds of housing typologies in the same neighborhood?
Yeah.
Wait. So apartment buildings next to single family homes?
Exactly.
So one of the things, so you alluded to this idea of the reverse mortgage. Can you tell our listeners what that is and why it hasn't worked?
So the reverse mortgage is a tool to allow older households to tap into their housing wealth. So it's a mortgage that you don't have to, similar to a HELOC, but you don't have to make payments on the mortgage, and the balance accrues until you sell the home or pass away. But they historically have been underutilized.
Right.
And there's been some changes to the HUD program in particular in the last few years. And there's a lot of growing research into why people aren't using reverse mortgages, or why people may or may not use HELOCs to tap into their housing wealth. Mm-hmm. But the take-up rates are low in general. So I think we can't rely on something, for now at least, we can't rely on something like that to solve our problems. Mm-hmm. We probably just need lots of different options for households.
And what about, there was an idea at some point, there was an insurance hedge where you could buy some kind of product that was inversely correlated to your housing market's fluctuation, so that when your housing price goes down, this product's value went up.
Yeah. I remember this too. This must have been in John Quigley's class that we talked about this.
The dream, I think it was a Robert Schiller dream product,
Yes,
but
I totally
it never
remember
materialized.
Yeah, as far as, I haven't seen it, and that was more than a decade ago, that class.
It sounds like the kind of insurance program that only an economist could love, the thing that just sounds so great in theory, but in practice, no one is interested in for one reason or another. Maybe because they just don't like to think about, they like that upside. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe no one expects their home values to go down.
In all fairness, though, I just think that we've got to do more than rely on housing.
Right.
We need a broader safety net of things that are not just focused on the home.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, maybe a second extension of the study is a similar study in a country that has a broader safety net. Because I wonder if in a Germany or something where your negative housing shock would produce the same effects, that would be a double bummer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea, like looking at this in a country that doesn't have the same reliance on housing wealth and has more of a safety net for retirees, and to see if you see the same kind of outcome.
Because to some extent, you're making this calculation about your future savings, the money you're going to have in retirement, you're going to pass to your kids, and then something changes. And so it's like, how much of it is psychological reaction to like some loss aversion thing where you're like, oh no, I have a little bit less. And how much of it is like actual rational calculation about, oh, that changes my plans, so I'm going to work a little longer. And I think in a country where it's not like you're going to ever be living on the street, right, in a country that would definitely take care of you in your old age no matter what, you still might have the psychological effect even if you don't have the like rational calculus effect.
Right. I think that's really fair, because that is something also the literature finds, right? There's loss aversion in housing prices. So people are less likely to sell their homes if they think it's not going to sell for the sticker price they had in their head. And that's one thing we can't unpack or untangle in this study. But using a different country setting where you could really figure out how much of this is loss aversion versus how much of this is we need this wealth, we're relying on this wealth, would be really helpful for understanding a policy solution.
Yeah, I do think it's important to just highlight what you're both gesturing toward here, which is that all of these decisions are kind of happening in a context where people have to be concerned that if they make the wrong decision, if they take their retirement too early, then they might die poor. Like their money might run out before their life does. And because we have such a weak social safety net, they might become homeless. They might, not be able to afford medical expenses, what have you. And so I think just keeping that in mind, that like there's very real consequences for making the wrong decisions, in part because we rely so much on housing wealth and have so little to back it up. I just want to, underscore that again.
Yes, that's really fair. And I think that there's literature that shows that older adults don't downsize as they age. And part of it, the explanation is the safety net aspect of it, right? You may need your house in 10 years. You don't know how long you're going to live. So people don't want to tap into that wealth.
All right. Jackie Begley, thank you so much for coming on the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You can read more about Jackie's research on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Pavo is at El Pavo. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.